Hey guys, Mr. Cannon. So we are checking out the classwork video today for calculating GDP. Things to be aware of. First thing, I would take down any new concepts in this video, of which there will be many, in your notes because I won't be lecturing over it independently, so make sure you do that. Second, you'll want to check out the assignment titled Calculating GDP. That'll be in cycle 4, and it will be the assignment for today. Following that, we're going to go into the concept of unemployment, which we calculated, not calculated, we looked at last year, and you'll be calculating today and next class. So that is the process that I would use. Okay, to start, reminders about GDP. So GDP stands for gross domestic product. As a reminder, meaning gross as the cumulative, so all. Domestic meaning what is in our home or in our borders. So we are looking at the total price and value of all goods produced and sold inside a set of borders. When you see domestic, think about things like people who might clean houses for a living. They are considered domestic workers. And so when you think domestic, it is inside one home, one house, or one country. Then product, obviously, that's related to production or what we are producing. So gross, everything domestic within our house, product, what we are making and selling. And so this is the total value of everything we are making and selling inside our house or our country. And this would be for every country, obviously. For the sake of ease, we will be using the US for the whole video. Now, if we want to figure that out, there are 4 components to this. We've covered this already. We are using what's called the expenditure approach to calculate GDP. And what that allows us to do is put together the 4 components for GDP. So we have C, which equals consumer, so all of consumer spending. We look at G, all government spending. We look at I, all business spending or business investment, and then X minus M, which is exports minus imports, so all foreign entity spending. So between consumers, the government, foreign entities, and businesses, we find total spending inside our domestic borders or house, and then we can put together our GDP. So all we have to do is put all those 4 together, and then we have what's called our nominal GDP. Now, brief reminder, I'm not going to go into a ton of detail because it's review, but this does not conclude every single sale. So the point of our GDP is we're trying to figure out the strength of our current economy. So the example I always give has to do with books. So let's imagine you say that your New Year's resolution is to read 12 books this year, so a book a month. Let's imagine you read 1 book in January, you read it again in February, again in March, and again, and you read it once a month all the way through December. At the end of the year, you cannot say you've read 12 books. You might have read a book 12 times, but you can't look at someone and say, I have read 12 books because I read the same one 12 times. Well, the economy works the same way. If I were to build a house and sell it for $200,000, and then someone sells it back to me for $200,000, we haven't made $400,000 worth of product. So we do not count used goods, anything sold on Craigslist or whatever. You know, that washing machine from last year that I always talked about and I was trying to sell it. If I buy it for $300 and then I sell it to, someone for $300, the economy has not produced $600 worth of production. We just haven't. We don't include intermediate goods. So let's say I produce metal that gets put into a washing machine as a part. I can't include the metal and the part because then I'm counting it twice. So that's the big rule, is you cannot count things twice, and it has to be new to that year. So I can't say McDonald's when we calculate GDP, we can't count the beef that McDonald's produces and the sale of a burger, because the sale of a burger automatically includes the beef. So we can't include what's called down here intermediate goods. We can't include non-market transactions. So that would have to do with any illegal sales, any sales that aren't being recorded and things like that. Parallel markets, we've talked about that. And we can't include what's called that's non-market activity. We can't include non-market transactions. So that would be like if you get a social security, or your grandparent maybe gets a social security check every month. If they get money in, just a check from the government, we can't count that because that money inevitably gets spent, at which point it does count. So if you get, a $2,000 check from your job, that counts as wages for them. But if your grandparent gets a $2,000 check from the government for retirement or something like that, we can't count that $2,000 because if they took that $2,000 and then spent it on $2,000 of caramel chocolates, then it would be counted twice. So that is, just giving someone money is not going to be counting, especially if it's for retirement. It's not going to be counted because it would be counting it twice. And it doesn't include income earned abroad from American firms. So all of the McDonald's in Russia, all of their income is not included for GDP. Now, a couple variations we have. So we have our first raw one, which is called nominal. And when you think of nominal sounds like numbers. So it is the just raw number of GDP. It is just when I take how much is spent and how much is produced, that first number we get, that is our nominal GDP. It's our C plus G plus I plus X minus N. Now, a couple variations we have on that. We can look at that and we can divide that by population, and that'll be GDP per capita. And again, like when I think GDP per capita, I think about like cap, and I'm wearing mine because I still desperately need a haircut, but I think about per person, right? Per cap, per person. So I take my GDP divided by individual, and it tells me what my GDP per person is. I could also look at my real GDP, which is my GDP that takes inflation into an account, because obviously prices rise over time. And so if that is the case, we need to take that into account. I can look at my GNI, which is my gross national income. So this doesn't care about your domestic home, it cares about your nationality. So domestic product cares about what's inside your domestic home, whereas gross national includes your nationality. So someone might have a company, that is in Italy. And if that company is making money, you would say, what nationality is the owner? And if they said American, that means the money is coming back to the US as income. So think McDonald's is the easy example, Disney in Tokyo and Hong Kong and all that. I think there's a Disney in Hong Kong. I know there's one in Tokyo, but those are American companies, and then the income is coming back to the US. And so that would count in our GNI. And then we've got green that we're not going to look at today, but that is including the externalities of pollution and things like that. So we might say, hey, look, our GDP was, yay high this year, but we caused so much pollution that actually we're going to wind up having to pay a lot of it back as a society. So it includes a lot of that market failure created by that. Again, it's the word GDP, and it's the word green. So when you think green, a company is going green, it's usually more environmentally friendly is the connotation there. And so a green GDP is a GDP that includes a lot of that. Okay, here's the new stuff though. So we're going to talk about just calculating GDP and then going into the different variations of it. So the simplest one, which we'll start with, is how to just calculate raw nominal GDP. Again, when you think nominal, think numbers. It is the numbers tell you this is how much our country is producing at this time. So we have the data for a country called Canaanland, and this is in billions. So I have my consumers, C, plus I, businesses, plus G, government, plus X minus M, foreign exports minus imports, X minus imports. And this import isn't an I because we already used it for businesses. So here's my data chart. I have this is in billions, $11.3 billion in consumer spending. Awesome. I have $3.2 billion in business spending. Great. I have $3.5 billion in government spending. Also good. We are exporting or selling, because export is external, outside. We are selling $2.5 billion worth of goods, and then buying or importing $2.1 billion worth of goods. So this would be like selling, American soybeans to China, and then buying, cheap toys or something from China. So buying plastics and selling soybeans or whatever. So to figure out what our raw or nominal GDP is, we would take all these, put them together, 11.3 plus 3.2 plus 3.5 plus 2.5 minus 2.1, because we're trying to find our net gain and loss here. And that would wind up with 18.4. So the nominal GDP for this country, for Canaanland, would be $18.4 billion. And again, we use that we're using the expenditure approach. So it would be C plus I plus G plus X minus M. Pretty straightforward, but that would be how we figure out our nominal GDP. Now, if we are looking per capita, we are looking per cap, again, per person, per head. So per head in the country. Now, here's the reason we do this is because you might look at your GDP and say your GDP is a sign of strength, right? And so if I look at a country with a higher GDP than another country, I might reasonably assume that the country with the higher GDP must be better to live in than the country with a lower GDP. But when you include population, that might not be the case. So let's look at an example here. So we have Sweden and we have China. So China has a nominal GDP of 12.2 trillion US dollars a year. And Sweden has a nominal GDP of 500 and change billion dollars a year. Meaning, if I were to just look at how much is being produced in the country, I would say, my God, China has a significantly stronger economy. It must be a much better place to live in. The quality of life must be higher. People in that country must be able to afford so much more. And that would make sense because they make so much more stuff, right? Now, if we're considering their population, though, if we look at it, their GDP per capita, you can take their GDP, their nominal GDP rather, and divide that by population. Now that's going to give us a far different number. Now, if I look at China, I'm taking, $12 trillion, but I'm dividing it up between 1.4 billion people. If I'm taking Sweden's $500 billion, that's a lot less money, but I'm dividing it up between only 10.12 million people. So this is like two-ish Houstons, and this is like way more than two-ish Houstons, right? Now, if I divide that number, I'll see that per person, the economy in China produces only $8,800 a year. So think about that, because that means that is the total revenue of a country, and every single person, if it were divided evenly, would only have access to $8,800. A third of the price of the average American car, right? Whereas in Sweden, the average person would be, if everything was equally distributed, would be receiving almost, a little over $53,000 per person per cap, right? So the reason we do this is because it gives us a better understanding of quality of life, or quality of living, I should say, in terms of finances, right? So like if I told you, I'm going to give team A $1,000 and team B $200. Team A has 500 people on it. Team B has 2 people on it, right? So $1,000 sounds better, but if there's 500 people on the team, everybody's getting $2. Team B gets a couple $100, but if there's only 2 people on the team, they're going to make more money. And that's how we look at this. If we look at this larger GDP, it seems great, but if the population is also big, then the reality is that it's not going to be distributed as, let's say, they won't be as happy with the values that they get. So that's the thing to consider for that. Now, brief reminder about what inflation is. We have a video coming up for that. But in terms of what it is, remember, when we talk about inflation, it's not the same thing as an inflationary gap. An inflationary gap is any time on the business cycle or on the aggregate supply and demand curve when the economy is in a period of high GDP, low unemployment, strength, but it's almost like an engine that's overheating. It's unsustainable, okay? Now, inflation, period, when I just say inflation, I'm referring to prices, and prices are rising faster over time. Now, an example I use every year when I talk about this is the difference between nominal earnings and real earnings for movies. So if I were to look at the top 10, just for those of you who did not have me last year, if I were to look at the top 10 highest grossing films of all time, These are films that made the most money. You can look and see, okay, we've got Avatar, Titanic, Star Wars, Jurassic Park. Obviously, this is maybe from 2 years ago. Furious 7, Avengers. And the common thread here is that these movies are all from the last 10 years or so, other than Titanic, because that made so much money. So the common thread is that they're all from a long time, from the recent history. Now, if I were to consider the fact that movie tickets cost differently now than they used to, tickets on average when this poll was taken were $10.50 a ticket. Tickets in 1939 were 23 cents a ticket. So here's the thing. Gone with the Wind came out in 1939. If you were to just look at how much money it made, it would have no chance of being the highest grossing film, even if so many more people saw it. So inflation is the process where prices are rising over time. And if I were to not consider inflation when I look at things like rankings in terms of earnings, I wouldn't realize that most of the films on this top list don't even come close to the highest grossing films of all time. If I were to make every ticket, let's say, for Gone with the Wind, if I were to make every one of those 23-cent tickets worth $10.50, it would actually be the highest grossing film of all time, because I'm considering the fact that prices were lower then than they are now. And what you'll notice is when you look at the highest grossing films that are adjusted for inflation, all of a sudden we see 30s, 70s, 60s, 50s, 80s, 60s, 90s, 70s, 2000s, 30s. And the diversity is extremely strong because these films are getting the adjustment that is required to understand just how popular they were with moviegoers. When you don't consider the fact that tickets cost less money, it looks like up here, it looks like no one watched movies back then. But when you consider the fact that movie tickets cost more now, it's very clear that the highest grossing films of all time are pretty diverse in terms of years. They're just not being fairly represented because tickets cost less and everything costs less back then. So when we look at GDP over time, the same thing happens. We might look at a country's GDP over time and say, man, the US had a rough economy in the 70s, it did. But the reality is that on top of that, everything costs less money. So our total GDP, of course, will be lower. Now, here's an example here. We might take our nominal GDP and notice that, okay, we've got burgers, haircuts, and tractors. So I sell a quantity of my economy, let's say in Cannon Land, sells a quantity of 37 burgers for $3 a piece, meaning I'm going to say dollars, even though it says pounds, just for ease of remembrance. So 37 haircuts or burgers for $3 is 111. 15 haircuts for $18 for $270 total, because it's my revenue. And then 10 tractors for $50 a piece for $500. When I add all those together, those would get me $881. That would be my nominal GDP. Now, if I look the next year, I sell more of each item, but you'll notice the prices rose. So burgers went from $3 to $4. Haircuts went from 18 to 20, and tractors went from 50 to 60. So even though the increase in quantity isn't that high, I've actually increased my nominal GDP for 2002 by a pretty significant margin from 881 to 1160. And while some of this is selling more of an item, a lot of this has to do with the fact that everything just costs more. So if I look at it just as a flat, raw, nominal number, it looks like the economy is stronger. And then you can look at 2003 as well. We actually sell fewer burgers, but the burgers are getting more expensive. They go from $4 to $5. We sell fewer tractors, but they go from $60 to 65. So when we find out the nominal GDP, it looks higher. Now, if I were to just leave it in nominal, we wouldn't learn anything. We would just look at this and say, man, our country is doing so great. Every single year it gets stronger. But what real GDP does is it finds out the real fluctuation. And what you do is you pick a year and you say, this is going to be my what's called a base year. You pick a base year, and then you say, we're going to use these prices for all years, and we're going to figure out which years actually have the strongest GDP. So if we look at it with real GDP, in this example, we pick a base year of 2001. So in 2001, we were selling burgers for $3, haircuts for 18, and tractors for 50. And what this chart has done is it includes those prices at every level. So even though in 2002 and 2003, all three of these items cost more money, this chart takes that into consideration and uses 2001 pricing. By doing that, it's calculated what it considers a real GDP, or a GDP that actually accounts for these price changes. So you'll see that our GDP for 2001 has not adjusted. It's still 881. But our next year, instead of 1160, because it includes our old pricing, because we're trying to come up with a pricing scheme that matches old and new, it only goes up to 976. So you'll see that it is much more sobering in terms of how much the economy has grown. And then when we get to 2003, in our nominal GDP, we go from 1160 to 1223, and our GDP increases. But when we account for inflation, our GDP actually decreases from 976 to 941. So when we take inflation into account, although our nominal GDP might be significantly higher, our real GDP actually betrays us and shows us how an economy might look higher when we look at numbers, but the reality is that it might be shrinking. And this is the trick that inflation plays on us. And essentially, like I said, the process is picking a base year and then centering all the prices around that base year. Now, what we use for that is something called a price or a GDP deflator. Now, these deflators are numbers, we're going to figure out how to calculate these later, but these deflators are numbers that we use in our calculations to take our nominal GDP, so our number that is based off of just the raw GDP, and then dividing that by this deflator number, multiplied by 100, and then it tells us, okay, but for real though, in 2001, how strong would this economy be? Okay, so I'll give you a couple examples here. So, where's my calculator? That's a crazy number. We don't need that number. Okay. So a couple examples here. So our formula is up on the top right. It says real GDP is our nominal or just raw number GDP divided by our price deflator multiplied by 100 to get our percentage. Okay. Because we're trying to figure out what our real GDP is. So here's our example. It says, suppose we are given the following values of nominal GDP. Now we're going to look at 2002 here. It says that our nominal GDP in 2002 is 9237. That's 2002. So that's my nominal GDP. So that's my numerator here. I need to divide it by my price deflator, which is 118.8. So I'm going to divide it by 118.8. That gives me 77.75. And then okay, technical problem, redoing this problem. So we've got 9237 divided by 118.8. So that's my price or GDP deflator. So that gives me 77.7 and change. Now the final point, as you can, or the final step, as you can see in the formula, is multiplied by 100, and that will give me 7,775 and change. And if we look down at the formula completed down here, we have our nominal GDP divided by our price deflator for 2002 multiplied by 100, and that gives us 7.7 and change, bring it back, billion in real GDP. Now, here's the thing. If I were looking at my normal nominal GDP, I would say we went from 7.8 billion to 9.2 billion. And what your average non-economically educated person would say, or your politician looking to make the economy look stronger would say. They would say, see, we went from 7.8 billion to 9.2 billion. Look at how strong the economy is. But when we account for inflation, actually the economy got weaker. It shrank, it's been smaller. So we went from 7.8 billion, and when we include inflation, we're at 7.7 billion. And so that's why this is important, is because whether it's the person down the street who doesn't understand how money works, or it's a politician telling you, look at all the good I'm doing, the economy might be technically larger in a nominal way. But if you're not including for inflation, you're basically telling a story with made up numbers, because inflation plays a huge role in all of this. Let's do another one here. Let's do 2003. So it says in 2003, the nominal GDP, I'm looking down here, the nominal GDP was 10.732 billion. That was our nominal GDP. Again, significantly stronger than our beginning. And it says that the price deflator, which is what we need to divide it by, was 130. So we go divided by 130. That gives me 82 and change. Our final step is multiplied by 100. That's me 82.55. So $8.2 billion. Now, if I were looking at this as a politician, I would say I have made the economy stronger every single year. But as as a savvy voter or a savvy economist, what I would look at and say, actually, the economy got weaker in 2002. And then with 8.2 billion as real GDP, it got stronger in 2003. And whereas a non-economically educated person would say, look, the economy is getting better and better and better, better and better. You would say it was strong in 2001, weaker in 2002, stronger in 2003. Because when we include for inflation, the reality is that the economy shrank a bit, and then strengthened a bit as well after that. And that is how we would calculate that. So we have our nominal GDP divided by our price deflator, which you will typically be given, multiplied by, by 100. Double check. Yep. Final slide. Okay. Final slide. So stay with me here. You're all right. So final thing is looking for a change in GDP. Okay. This one's real easy formula. So all we do is change over initial. So this is not midpoint formula. We're not doing any midpoint anymore, just like we used to. We are looking at our change in GDP over our initial GDP. And I'm going to get my calculator. So this will tell us what actual percentage change in GDP we underwent. And for sake of argument, let's go back to the last slide. Figure that out. So I have my new real GDP of 7.775 and my old GDP of 7.850. Okay. Now, if I want to figure out what happened to the GDP, I need to take my new minus the old, as you can see, final value of real GDP minus the initial value of real GDP over the initial. So basically, change minus original. So let's take our calculator here. And so my new one down here is 7775. That's my new, minus old 7850. It gives me negative 75. And that negative is important because it got smaller. Now I divide that by my original. My original is 7850. Gives me negative 0.009. And then I multiply it by 100. This says that between 2001 and 2002, the economy shrank by 0.95%. Okay. And again, this is important because if I just looked at the nominal GDP, top here, if I didn't understand how these numbers worked, I would look at a country's economy, or I would listen to a politician tell me, or I would listen to all these things and I would say, man, The economy must be getting better. It's growing, it's strengthening. But the reality is that if inflation is too high, even if your nominal GDP is growing, you can be experiencing almost 1% shrinkage, that the economy is getting smaller. Okay, let's do the last one. So again, I'm going to show you again, percentage change in real GDP. We have our final value minus our initial value, so our change, over the initial value. We figured that out by coming up with an example. Our final value here, 82.55, minus our initial value, 7775, 480. So now I'm trying to figure out the percentage change from 2002 to 2003. So I have my difference. I need to divide it by my initial value and multiply by 100. So I divide it by my initial value, which is down here, 7775. Gives me a crazy small number, multiply by 100. Gives me 6.17, meaning the economy grew 6.17% between 2002 and 2003. Okay, and the important point here is not necessarily to remember all the numbers, it's just the process, right? We're just finding percentage change, and we're not using midpoint. So we have final value minus initial over initial. This is how you would find percentage change in most math classes. Not for us when we calculate midpoint formula, but for most math classes, it would be this: final new minus old over initial to find percentage change. And just so you can know, just for you to know, if you need to clarify this, I would take a look at this scenario down at the bottom left, and then check out the process that they used for this. You can also look at this table. This table is correctly calculated. So if you need to do a couple practice examples, you can look at this table and check yourself against that. At this point, this covers the bulk, the overwhelming bulk of calculating GDP scenarios. And you can, once you get the notes down, you can move on and go to the calculating GDP practice. Thank you for watching. Thanks, y'all.